How you doing? Today is the first day of the horror month, aka October for some of you who don't know, and the Halloween content begins. Well, it actually began last month, but technically it's supposed to begin this month, and what I'm going to be doing this month is I'm going to have a bunch of rankings, but most of them are going to be Resident Evil rankings. Now, if you did not check my Five Nights at Freddy's games rankings, then you don't know how this works, so let me explain it to you really quickly. Essentially, there's going to be 4 different ranking videos. The first one is going to be ranking each of the Resident Evil games based off of their horror, which one I find the scariest, which is this video right here. The second one is going to be ranking the Resident Evil games based off of gameplay, and which game overall is more fun to play, which game has the better graphics, the better difficulty, the better gameplay, replayability, and all that stuff. And then the third video is going to be based off of story, and which Resident Evil game has the best story narrative and how it tells it throughout the game. And the last one, of course, is going to be ranking them from worst to best overall, all 14 of the Resident Evil games, which I should clarify because I'm only going to be counting Resident Evil 0 through 8, Resident Evil Code Veronica, and the 4 remake games. I am not including Revelations. I could care less about Revelations. It's a spin-off in my eyes, so I'm not going to be putting it in any of my rankings. Is it canon? Yeah, it's canon, but to me, it's a spin-off more than it is a mainline game, so I'm not going to include it. Starting off this horror list, which is the game that I find the least scariest out of all the Resident Evil games, I'm going to have to say is going to be the original Resident Evil. And I know this may be a little bit divisive. Is it divisive or decisive? Decisive because, you know, it's the original game. It's the first Resident Evil game in this franchise. It's where we are at right now. It's what we got. I personally was never a huge fan of this original OG Resident Evil. I mean, just look at the fucking graphics. I mean, obviously at the time it was a lot better because it was new, it was fresh. It was a horror game that had like unique style of how you played the game and how you told that story. But like today's day and age, it's very outdated, and I don't think anybody's going to get scared from polygons. However, to give credit where credit is due, there is a game today that is called Iron Lung, which actually is really good with how it utilizes sound and creating that horror despite being terrible in graphics. But this original Resident Evil, even if I go back to play, I don't think there's any sort of placement that would genuinely scare me except for like the opening of the first zombie. It's just not going to work. Coming in 13th place is going to be Resident Evil 6. Now, I'm going to keep this one short. We all know how Resident Evil 6 turned out to be. It's not really a survival horror game. It's more of an action game. But even so, I could find parts or certain imagery and visuals to be more graphic and disgusting and disturbing than something like polygons of the original Resident Evil. So that's why I'm putting it 13th place. But overall, it's still not as scary. I mean, especially when you have this. I think people are going to find that more lewd than scary. Staying on that same train, coming in 12th place is going to be Resident Evil 5. This is another Resident Evil game that's more action focused than it is horror focused. There's not really that many parts in the game other than perhaps like one mini boss fight that takes place in this confined area that could be scary, but other than that, it's not really that scary either. Taking 11th place is going to be Resident Evil Code Veronica. Now, I may not be remembering correctly, but I don't personally think there was a point in Resident Evil Code Veronica that really scared me to my core, but there's definitely some creepy elements to Code Veronica. It's one of the 4 games that are just very outdated, and it really deserves a remake. I hope they announce a remake for Code Veronica, because a remake would be fucking awesome, especially if they have like good storytelling. What I look for in a remake, I look for better gameplay overall, plus adding on to an already good story, like for example RE1, but we'll cover more on that when we get to that video. Coming in 10th place, unfortunately, I'm gonna have to put Resident Evil Village. Now, Resident Evil Village, for all intents and purposes, was supposed to take what Resident Evil 7 had and expanded upon it, give it more lore, give it more pizzazz, and it has the gothic-like theme that Resident Evil 4 kind of had, but it really explores it here. Unfortunately, I don't think they explored the horror as well as they could with that gothic aesthetic. Coming in 9th place is going to be Resident Evil 3 Remake. Now, the Resident Evil 3 Remake is another one of those Resident Evil games that focus more on on action than it did survival horror, and because of that, it makes it less scary. But why I find it more scary than some of the ones I already talked about is because Nemesis still feels like a threat when he's actually there. Even though you can dodge and do all this shit, Nemesis chasing you around at full top speed and even going as far as to go into safe rooms to get you, that is pretty intimidating, I'm not gonna lie to you. Coming in 8th place is going to be Resident Evil 0. Now, if there's any Resident Evil game that I barely know anything about, it's Resident Evil 0. Resident Evil 0 is just not one that really resonates with me in a lot of ways, but horror-wise, I'd say that horror is probably middle of the road in terms of how creepy and aesthetically scary it could be, but nothing really memorable for me to really discuss right now to put it any higher. In that similar vein, coming in 7th place is going to be the Resident Evil 1 remake. Now, given the fact that I know more about the remake of Resident Evil than Resident Evil 0, I could easily say that Resident Evil definitely has more scary moments in terms of like what they have. They have the Crimson Redhead mugs, they got Lisa Trevor, but overall, quality-wise, in terms of horror and what can really scare me and get under my skin, I don't really think there's that many things from the original Resident Evil, as I already put it at the bottom of the list, to get under my skin. But definitely this remake improved a lot in terms of that aspect. Coming in 6th place is going to be the original Resident Evil 4. Now, I say the original Resident Evil 4 because the original is kind of on the middle road of being both an action game and a survival horror, but it more so focuses on action than survival horror, but it still has the survival horror elements. It's got some enemies that are pretty creepy and how they can be utilized. For example, the regenerators and the whole and all that crap. And I also like the cult aesthetic that this game has, that I also like in the next entry here. 5th place is going to be Resident Evil 4, the remake, which I do think is a bit scarier because of the graphics and the darkness and how they do the lighting and such, but it's still not like scariest Resident Evil game territory for me. It's definitely creepy in how it utilizes things. It's definitely intimidating with how much you have to fight and how much you have to fend, but in terms of horror, it's not really the scariest that it could be. Coming in 4th place is going to be the original Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Yeah, I know that this game probably scared a lot of you when you were younger, having that big motherfucker Nemesis running, chasing after your ass in the polygon, so I'm gonna give you the respect where it's due. I still don't think the polygon shit is that scary to me, but in terms of having Nemesis chase you around, that's very intimidating. I'm gonna put it right where it belongs, in my opinion. And on that same wavelength, coming in 3rd place is gonna be Resident Evil 2, the original. Resident Evil 2, the original, had like the perfect horror aesthetics overall for me, to where you had all these different environments like the sewer and the police station and the city, the town, and the laboratory, and you had these different threats that could come in and pose as a different threat, like Mr. X, the Tyrant, or William Birkin with the fucking big ass arm and shit that could be very intimidating at times. And the way they utilized the jump scares and the scary aesthetics in this game was so much better. Even the music is fucking perfection when it comes to horror. It's not over the top loud sounds, jump scared sounds. It's just perfectly crafted to be creepy and eerie and intense when it needs to be. Coming in 2nd place is going to be the Resident Evil 2 remake. Yeah, the Resident Evil 2 games, they're back to back, but I find the remake far more scarier, and how, like I said, how they utilize the horror and the intimidation and getting you amped up. Like Mr. X especially, how they utilize Mr. X is just perfect horror all around. He's not there jumping out of closets and shit to scare you. I mean, he does do that occasionally, but he's not there to like scare you. He's just there to be intimidation, and he could fuck you up at any point in time. You're just running around from him, and you have stuff like lickers, and some zombies have some weird like animation styles where they come at you. It's really well done in the horror in this game as well. But for me, the scariest Resident Evil, without even a question of a doubt, is going to be Resident Evil 7. How they utilize the confined area of Resident Evil 7 to create the horror aesthetic with the mold and all this disgusting looking stuff to make it like really it's just perfect. And how they did it with Resident Evil 7 and like all the stuff, including the kid who does like the saw trap type of shit, the bug lady who's Jack Baker's wife. I forgot her name. Jack Baker himself, and him being this intimidating threat chasing after you, this pursuer who just keeps getting more and more disgusting overall. It's just well done, especially in VR. VR makes it even fucking more terrifying. But obviously, you know, it's a VR game. When it's a VR game, it's gonna be 20 times as scary. So I give it the leverage where it's due. But overall, this is easily for me the scariest Resident Evil game. What about y'all? What's the scariest Resident Evil game to y'all? I'm sure some of you will say the classics. I'm sure some of you would say the remakes. And maybe there's a few of you that might say the middle. I don't really think so, but we'll see. Overall, it's all opinion-based, subjective, and yada yada. Let's get it done. I'll read it.